Hi, I'm Tansy Hammarton. I work at the University of Glasgow. I'm a molecular cell biologist and I study parasites. So one of my parasites that I study, a trypanosome here, is shown up at the top here. And I'm very interested in how cells divide. So this is a trypanosome that's in midway through cell division. You can see it's in the process of splitting into up the cell here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about trypanosomes later on, but in this session I want to tell you about cells, what they are, how they look, and I hope to get across to you just the huge diversity there is in different types of cells. I'm going to tell you what a cell's made up of, and then I'm going to show you towards the end how to make your own edible cell, so you can make it out of jelly and sweeties or out of biscuits and other components and things. Okay, so what are cells? Well, they're the building blocks of all living things. So any living organism is made up of one or more cells. So you get some organisms which are just made up of one cell. They're unicellular, single-celled. And examples of these are bacteria. So here's one type of bacterium called Staphylococcus aureus that has this spherical shape. Some organisms are multicellular, but in the grand scheme of things, they don't have that many cells. So C. elegans is a little worm that lives in the soil, and it's about 1 millimetre or 2 in length, and it has around about 1,000 cells. And you can see all those cells highlighted by these blue dots in the image. Now, that sounds like quite a lot of cells, but when you think about the average adult human, they will have about 30 trillion cells. And that's just the human cells. We have what's known as our microbiome, which is a collection of bacteria, fungi and other microorganisms that live on us, on our skin and inside us, for example, in our guts. And it's estimated that there's about 38 trillion of them on the average human. So we're about half human and half bacteria. So how big are cells? Well, many cells are really, really small, and they're so tiny you could only see them. You can't see them with the naked eye. You need a microscope to be able to see them. So, for example, if you're thinking about bacteria, then if you take one of your hairs, and you think about how thin that hair is, then across that width of the hair, you could line up around 80 bacteria end to end. So they're really, really small, and you need a microscope to see individual bacterial cells, and we normally need to stain them as well. So there's some bacteria here, some rod-shaped bacteria, you can just see them all here, and these have been stained pink. Now, if you allow bacteria to grow on an agar plate, as we do in the lab, then when you have enough of them all together in a group, which we call a colony, you can then see it with the naked eye. So one of these colonies here probably has 1 billion or more bacteria inside. So that's how tiny they are. Now, not all cells are that small. So you have various nerve cells in your body, we call them neurons, and there's one that runs from the base of your spine down to your big toe, and that can be about up to 1 metre long, depending on how tall you are. So other large cells that you will have seen probably yourself. So I don't know if you've come across frog spawn out in the environment, maybe in a pond or in a stream somewhere. That's frog's eggs. So they're pretty big cells, but nowhere near as big as the largest cell, which is an ostrich egg. So all eggs are cells. So here's a chicken's egg for comparison. Here's an ostrich egg, and here's an ostrich, baby ostrich that's just hatched. So some cells can be really massive. So big diversity in size, but also in shape as well. Now, before I go on and show you some pretty pictures of lots of cells, there's just a few things I need to explain at the beginning in terms of how we take these pictures and generate these pictures as scientists. So, as I've mentioned already, in order to see cells, we quite often have to stain them because they're too translucent, otherwise that we wouldn't see them down the microscope. So here's some cells that have been stained pink, some bacterial cells, and they're just viewed under light microscopy. Now, we can use a special microscope called a fluorescence microscope, where we use a UV light to shine on the cells, and that works if they're expressing proteins that fluoresce under UV light. So that means that we've made them produce a particular protein that makes them glow, or they naturally produce those, or in some cases we can stain them with dyes that make them fluorescent. And so we can see them under the microscope lighting up. And these look really pretty. So this is a bit like a Christmas tree here, but these are all bacteria again, and some are expressing a green fluorescent protein and some are expressing a red one. So that's fluorescent microscopy. You can see how the background's quite dark. But then we can also enlarge cells even more using a more powerful microscope that we call a scanning electron microscope. And so using that, we would get typically grey images like this. So here's a load of bacteria again, much higher power this time. You can see much more detail than you can with these two types of imaging. But they maybe don't look quite as fun, but what we can do digitally is to then colour them in. And so sometimes that's just to make them look pretty, but sometimes it's to highlight features of those cells, or to show two different types of cells within an image in different colours. So you'll see some of those as we go through. It doesn't mean the cells themselves are those colours. They've either been dyed or coloured digitally afterwards. Okay, so here we have some blood cells. This is a scanning electron micrograph, so really high powered, and again they've been coloured in. So this came from blood from a cut, and so what we've got here are some red blood cells been coloured in red here, and you can see that they have this sort of characteristic dimple in the middle of them. Now we also have some white blood cells. So whereas red blood cells are the cells that carry oxygen around your body and collect carbon dioxide and return it back to the lungs when you breathe out, white blood cells are the ones that help you fight infections. So these are part of your immune system. And because this was from a cut, we've also got some platelets here and some fibrin strands here, and that's what your body uses to make a mesh or a clot to stop you bleeding. So that's blood cells. Now, also in the body, we have skin cells, and you think, oh, well, the skin cell is a skin cell. Well, actually not. So this is a cross-section through the skin. So if you imagine it's been taken through here, so this top layer here is the surface of your skin, and these cells here are just below the surface. So the whole thickness of this is, so this line here represents 1/10 of a millimetre. So this is maybe 2/10 of a millimetre, all in all. But you can see that there's quite a lot of diversity of skin cells, even just within that region. And then this is an image of frog skin, but it's taken this time from the top, so with the microscope looking down on the top layer of cells. Now, if we look at brain cells, they look very different again. So these are brain cells. So here we have neurons, or these brain cells have what's known as a nerve cell body, and then they have lots of processes, lots of strands coming off them, and that's for transmitting the messages, and depending on the direction of the message, they're either called axons or dendrites, and so you can see all of these have been highlighted here. So they can be very long. And then if we go back to the single-celled organisms, the bacteria, I showed you some rod-shaped bacteria already. These are a higher power, but we can also get spherical ones that I showed you on the first slide, and we can also get twirly ones, spiral ones called spirochetes as well. So there's a great range even amongst single-cell organisms. Now, there's a huge diversity amongst parasites, and that's what I like, so I'm going to show you just a few of them because I think they're really cool. So here we've got 3 parasites that live in your blood, but they're all a bit different. So the Plasmodium parasite causes malaria. I'm sure you've heard of malaria. It's spread via a mosquito that takes a blood meal and passes the parasite on. So the parasite takes many different shapes during its life cycle, and this is just one of its stages. So this is when it's developing inside red blood cells, so it lives inside your red blood cells, and this is what we call the ring form, and you can see all these forms look like a diamond ring. Now, so that's one parasite you may have heard of. You probably haven't heard of these two. So these are the ones that we work on in my lab. So this is Trypanosoma brucei. You only find this in sub-Saharan Africa. Like malaria, it's spread by a biting fly. This is a tsetse fly, and these aren't really to scale. This is much, much bigger than any of the other flies shown here. And it lives in your bloodstream, but this time doesn't go inside the red blood cells, it lives outside extracellularly. And it looks a little bit like a worm. It's not, it's a single cell parasite. Here's another image of trypanosome dividing, because I like dividing cells. But that's the trypanosome parasite. Causes a disease called sleeping sickness, which affects humans, or a related disease in livestock, and it can be fatal. So if it's not caught and not treated, it can be fatal, and people fall into a coma before they die, and that's why and they have disruptions to their sleep-wake cycle. So that's why it's called sleeping sickness. But as I say, you only get that in Africa. The other parasite we work on is called leishmania, and there's various species of leishmania. This one shown here is Leishmania mexicana, and it can give you really nasty ulcers. Other forms of leishmania can infect your internal organs and you can die from that. And so all these diseases are called leishmaniasis. Now, this parasite, it lives in your blood, but this time it infects white blood cells, so the cells that are trying to protect you from infection. So it manages to hide away in them. So this is an image of a white blood cell. You can just see the outline of the cell here. This is the nucleus, the command center of the white blood cell. I'll tell you about them in a minute. And then all these little green and red cells in here are the leishmania parasites. And this is them at a higher power. Now they look quite different in a sandfly because they, like the trypanosome here with this little tail, this flagellum, that it helps. So this helps them to swim, and they have a flagellum when they're in the sandfly, but they don't. They lose that flagellum almost entirely, just a little stub left when they go into white blood cells. So that's but again, they're spread by a sandfly bite. So that's 3 parasites, all look very, very different down the microscope, all spread by different biting insects and live in different compartments of your blood. So that gives you an idea as to some of the diversity. Now, given that we're in the middle of a big pandemic, no talk will be complete on infection and cells and things will be complete without mentioning viruses and passing. But I'm mentioning them just to say that these aren't cells. Viruses are not cells, they're particles. So they're collections of proteins and genetic material. And they're quite often, these proteins are usually arranged in some kind of geometric shapes. They're quite complex sometimes and they look very pretty. Now they're tiny, 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 much smaller than cells. And so you have to have this scanning electron microscope, this really high powered microscope to be able to see them. So, and again, these are images that have been false coloured afterwards. So here is some norovirus, which can give you really nasty diarrhea. Here is flu, the flu virus, and here is a bacteria that looks a bit like a spaceship, doesn't it? But this is a bacteria. This is a virus that infects bacteria. So this is called a bacteriophage, and it perches on the cell. So this here is the bacterial cell wall, and it injects in its genetic material. And then all viruses, whether they're taken up by the cell or they inject their material into the cell, cause the cells to then stop making their normal proteins and start making virus particles. And so the cells are hijacked to become a virus-making factory. And that's how viruses replicate. Now, here, just to finish off the viruses section and to highlight just how tiny virus particles are some images of the SARS coronavirus 2. So this is the one that causes COVID-19, the reason we've all been in lockdown for months. So this is an image here of, this is a representation of the virus particles. You can see all the bits sticking out of it, look a bit like a crown, and that's why it's called coronavirus. It comes from crown and the crown-shaped structure that they have. And this is a cell that's being infected with coronavirus, and you can see all these, the red bits are cell, and the yellow bits are all the coronavirus particles stuck on the outside of the cell. So you can see from this just how tiny viruses are compared to cells. So remember, viruses are not cells. Okay, so back to cells. What is in a cell? So cells all have border around them that's called the cell membrane, or in some organisms they have a cell wall as well, so for example plants, and this acts as a bit of a fence, so it keeps all the components of the cell within the cell, but there are gaps in the fence and there are maybe gates in the fence, and so some particles, some for example nutrients can get into a cell, but also waste products and other things can get out as well. Now, within the cell, we have, I briefly mentioned this, we have a nucleus, which is the command center of the cell. This contains all the instruction manuals in the form of DNA and the genes that are in the DNA. And that has the instructions for the cell and tells it how to behave and what proteins to make and how those proteins should act within the cell. So, as well as that, the cell, so once it's, so it has the DNA to encode all these proteins to tell the cell which ones to make, but it needs somewhere to make them, and they're known as the ribosomes. So these are like protein-making factories that are scattered throughout the cell, and they're also present on this structure known as the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, don't worry too much about the long name. This is basically just a delivery network. So it's a bit like a sort of postal service, I guess, where it kind of takes the proteins that are made, it maybe packages them slightly differently, and then it sends them out around the cell to where they need to go. There's also a sorting office known as a Golgi that also helps with this. Now, proteins go around the cell, they carry out different functions according to what the cell needs, but when they've been used up and when they're not needed anymore, then the cell has to have some way of getting rid of them. And one of the places where it dumps all the unwanted proteins is in the lysosome. So this is a bit like a rubbish dump stroke recycling centre. It degrades the proteins and maybe recycles some of the components or sends them out as waste products. And then finally, for all of this to work, the cell needs some energy. And so it has some batteries, and they're known as mitochondria, or if you're talking about one of them, a mitochondrion. And so cells frequently have more than one. And then all of this material is contained within a jelly-like material known as cytoplasm, which keeps things together, but also allows some movement and for different components to move around the cell. So that's your sort of jelly-like cytoplasm. Now, cells, that's your basic typical animal cell, but I've just shown you there's a huge diversity of different types of cells. And one of my favourite cells that I haven't shown you is, again, it's another parasite. You can tell I'm biased, I'm sorry. Too many parasites in this talk, but this one's pretty cool because it has 2 nuclei. So most cells only have 1, but Giardia has 2, and it also has 8 flagella, which help it swim. And because it's got these 2 flagella, and it's got these 2 nuclei, and it's got a whole sort of skeleton within the cell, it actually looks like it's got a face as well. I'm sorry, rather like Giardia. It gives you horrible diarrhea though. I really wouldn't want to have it. Smelly diarrhea is not a good thing. Okay, now as well as the flagella that I've just shown you on Giardia, they're also found on a lot of other cells. So bacteria quite often have them. Some human cells have them too. A lot of parasites have flagella. They help with swimming and also sensing the environment. There are also smaller flagella-like structures that are known as pili in bacteria or cilia in other sort of mammalian cells or some parasites too. And they help with sensing the environment or in allowing cells to mate and sort of send messages to each other. And so you may see cells with those on. And then the other specialist structure that you may find in cells are the chloroplasts that you find in plants and algae and things like that. And these are green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll, and they are required for plants to undergo photosynthesis. So they take light and are able to convert that energy to sugars. Okay, so I'm going to show you in a minute how to make your own edible cell. So you can do that in a variety of ways. I'm going to show you how to do the jelly cells, but if you don't like jelly or you want a slightly healthier version, you could do what this is shown here, which is a fruit cell pizza. Or you could make cupcakes, cell cupcakes. You could make decorate biscuits. Here is a plant cell. You can see all these made on a cream cracker with some lemon curd spread on it for the cytoplasm and some green sweets representing the chloroplast. So you can make whatever you want. I'm going to show you how to make some jelly cells in just a second. But if you don't fancy making something edible, you could also make some up, do some cell art, either with Play-Doh or with whatever materials you may have lying around your house. So we'd love to see your cells. Please send us some pictures via Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. So you need to do that via the Science Festival, or you can tweet my lab as well, and we'll pass them. Okay, so we're going to make some jelly cells now. So you need some kind of container to make your cell in. I've got a Petri dish from the lab. You won't have that, so instead I would recommend using either a food tub that you might have at home. You could use an old yogurt pot. You could use the bottle of a drink, the bottom of a drinks bottle, or you could even use a sandwich bag. Doesn't matter. All of these represent the cell membrane or cell wall that's around a cell. Remember, that's like the barrier around the cell that keeps all the components of the cell inside. But it also has holes in it or gates in it to allow molecules to come in and out. So, for example, this allows the cell to take up nutrients from the environment, or it allows the cell to export waste products, for example. So I'm going to show you how to make an animal cell. But you can also, and I'll show you at the end how you can adapt this for other types of cell if you prefer to make something different. So I'm just going to make a generic animal cell, no particular type. But I need a nucleus. I'm using a fried egg for that. Remember, this is what contains the DNA or the instruction manuals of the cell, and it acts as the command center for the cell, telling the cell what to do and what proteins to make when and how to carry out its function. Now, as well as a nucleus, all cells need energy and they need some batteries, and these are found in the mitochondria. So I'm using jelly beans for these. and you'll have a number of mitochondria in any cell. You may also like to use some sultanas or raisins for this, and the reason for that is that they've got this sort of wrinkled surface, and down the microscope that's what mitochondria look like. So if you like them, you could put some raisins in as well. Now we've got energy and we've got DNA, and so we've got the instructions to make proteins, but now we need a protein making factory, and these are called ribosomes, and down the microscope they look like little dots. So I'm going to use, oops, ribosomes going everywhere, I'm going to use some cake sprinkles, hundreds and thousands, to represent my ribosomes. Now we've made protein now, but we also need to be able to transport it around the cell. So there's a transport system in the cell which has a very long name. It's called the endoplasmic reticulum, and it has various strands to it. So I'm just using some sort of jelly spaghetti type stuff. You could use strawberry lances as well. So I'm putting some of that in my cell. That's going to help package the proteins and send them in the right direction. And the cells also have a sorting office as well, that's known as a Golgi, that also helps with the packaging and processing of these proteins and transporting them around the cell. And I'm using dolly mixture for that. You can use what you like, but the reason I use dolly mixture is because they're striped, and Golgi have several layers, or several stacks as it's called, and so these look a little bit like a Golgi apparatus. So you can have several of those as well in your cells. So now we've got the transport system. It's a bit like a postal service with a sorting office to deliver the proteins around the cell to where they need to be. But once the proteins have done their job, the cell may not need them anymore. So they have a rubbish dump come recycling centre known as lysosomes. I'm using Skittles for these, and that's where the proteins that are no longer required are broken down, and they may be exported as waste products, or they might be components of them might be reused for the cell. So I've now got my lysosomes in there, and my animal cell is almost ready now. Now, if I was making a plant cell, I would also add another component, which are the chloroplasts. And these, I've used green Skittles. I've just taken them out from the lysosomes that I used the rest of the Skittles for earlier. But chloroplasts are green because they contain a pigment called chlorophyll, and they're what plants use to capture the energy from sunlight and be able to turn it into sugars for the plant to use. So if you want to make a plant cell, add some green Skittles as well. Okay, so now I've done that, I now need the final component, which is the jelly-like material called cytoplasm that surrounds it all. And they're surrounded by jelly to hold things in place, but also to allow some movement. Now my jelly's set a bit. So this is jelly I melted earlier. I just happen to have some vegetarian jelly crystals lying around. That melts quite quickly, but if you don't have that, jelly cubes are fine too. And if you want it to set quite quickly, you might want to make it up at double strength. It sets a bit quicker. Just be careful you don't scald yourself, obviously. Let it cool down enough so you're not going to hurt yourself before you pour it in. I use lemon jelly or yellow jelly of some variety because I think it's easier to see the components. But you can use whatever colour you prefer. Same goes for all the sweets. I've obviously showed you what I use, but you can use whatever you want. The only thing I would say is don't use anything that's chocolatey, because the minute you add warm jelly to chocolate buttons or M&Ms or Smarties or something like that, then it just melts the surface and you end up with a bit of a mess. So anything that's not chocolatey will work really well. So there we have our animal cell. Now, I've told you how you might make a plant cell, but you might want to get fancier still and make a bacteria or a parasite perhaps as well. So I've made here, I don't know if you can, how well you can see that, I've made a leishmania parasite. And so this is another way you can make cells, particularly if you don't like jelly. I know some people don't. What I've used here, you could use any biscuit, but I happen to use an oatcake because it was the easiest one to cut to the shape I wanted. So I've used an oatcake, I've spread it with honey to represent the cytoplasm. You could use jam or lemon curd or something like that if you wanted to, even chocolate spread. And then I've got my nucleus, I've got my endoplasmic reticulum, I've got my Golgi, I've got some lysosomal compartments up here, I've got my ribosomes throughout the cell, I've got my mitochondrion down here, and then I've got another specialist organelle known as the flagellum, and that's a bit like a tail, and it helps my leishmania parasite. Remember, this is the one that can give you horrible ulcers on your skin and is spread by the bite of a sandfly. It lives in, so this is a form of it that lives inside the sandfly host. It looks a little bit different from the forms in the white blood cells that I showed you earlier. And it has a flagellum that allows it to swim and sense the environment. So just put that there. And yeah, I hope you have lots of fun making your cells. I'd love to see some pictures of them, so please post them to Twitter or Instagram, Facebook, and yeah, enjoy. Hope you've enjoyed learning about cells and enjoy making your cells.